Today we will be talking about all of the features and some of the potential uses for an animation object. The animation object is a linear flipbook of frames. It will cycle through frames either forwards or backwards, and through special behaviors allow for random access. The animation object holds 2 frames in RAM at once. All frames should be the same size, otherwise the image may warp or tile. And for this example, we're using Jonathan James and the What If Monster. On page 5, I have 2 animations. The first being the What If Monster's arms waving up and down, and the second being Jonathan's hand painting on the canvas. And so, where you go to add an animation is in the Add menu in the top right-hand corner. And the drop-down menu will appear, and you can select Animation, and there are 2 different ways to import frames. The first being from individual frames. This allows you to select frames one by one and build the animation up in Composer. You can also add from a zip file, but let's go into the individual frames at first, and you select what I've already actually built up in Inspector and scroll down to Image Sequence. You can see that I've added a total of 8 frames to this animation. And if you want to have frames be the same for either timing adjustments or repeating part of the animation, you should add another frame and give it the same source image. Composer will then detect that the image is the same, and if it is the same as the current frame, it will skip any loading or frame swapping, boosting performance and RAM. So another way to compile your animation frames is on your desktop, and you can select all of your 8 frames and compress them into a zip file. The zip file method will extract all the files into an archive and automatically insert them in order into the image sequence. It's important to compress the contents of a directory, not the directory itself, when preparing a zip. So we're directly selecting the 8 frames, and we're going to right click and compress the 8 items. And as you can see, a zip file will appear, and you're going to have to rename it. For this, let's call it Painting. And then you just have to simply drop it into your Demibooks Composer Books Dropbox folder. And really easy, and it will appear right on your iPad. So now that we've inserted our animation object, we can make a few adjustments in the Inspector menu. So we can scroll down to Animation Properties, Image Sequence we've already talked about, Pausing Speed, we'll get into a little bit later, and frames per second is important because it will tell you how fast the animation will attempt to play. You can add frames per second by clicking the arrows or double tapping and changing it to, let's say, 24, which is the typical animation speed for cinematic movie productions. But for this, it's a little bit less intense, so we're probably going to stick with around 6 frames per second. You can toggle on Preload All Frames, which will attempt to cache all the animation frames, memory permitting, before the page is displayed. If this causes the app to RAM out, it will make things worse. But for small animations, it will ensure that they are smooth from the start and help to achieve a higher frames per second. You can toggle on Loops, which will set the animation to a continuous loop, and Autoplay, which tells the animation to play on page load. Tilt response is another interesting feature that will allow the angle of the iPad to be mapped directly to frames. The sub-options are roll and pitch. Roll means that the horizontal axis of the iPad is used to select the frame. Pitch means that the vertical axis of the iPad is used to select the frame. You can also change the degrees per frame, and this is how many degrees of rotation to use per frame. This is useful if you want to make things sparkle when the iPad is tilted, or make a character look at the user, or an eye in the painting to follow the user if you are making a horror book. Animations can be played forwards or backwards at half and normal and double speed. This can be used to make the objects seem to slow down or speed up at various points. The best example of this is in A Garden for Pig, where the pig tumbles through the gate and you will see him go fast, slow, and slow to a stop. To start with, the pig is playing his rolling animation double speed, and then it is played single speed, then half speed, with pause animation gradually. Pause animation gradually uses the pausing speed property located in the inspector menu. And as you can see, the pausing speed is set to 1, and pausing speed is a value multiplied by the frames per second to get a new frames per second for each frame update. So if the frames per second is 10 and the pausing speed is 0.5, you call pause animation gradually, and the frames per second of the animation plays at will go 10, 5, 2.5, 1.25, and then stop. The animation object has some special functions that allow you to have lots of control and simplify the mapping of complex behaviors. So scroll down and select Triggered by This. You can add if event user touch begins, then add a function to pig falls. And the function can be any one of these. The first one we'll talk about is toggle animation state function. And toggle animation state will play a stopped animation and stop a playing animation when called. So to enable somebody to play an animation when touched and stop when touched again, you can just make one behavior that calls toggle animation state and avoid using a touch zone and extra behaviors. Another animation state that you can change is move to next or previous frame. And this allows you to manually advance a single frame. So if you have something that moves through a state like a face going from sad to normal to happy, instead of mapping 3 images and doing the logic to hide 2 and show 1, then show the next, you could just make an animation object with 3 faces and call the next frame. This also saves RAM, as the animation object will only hold 2 frames at once and not all 3 like the image method would. Another one that you can select is Jump to Animation Frame. This gives you complete random access to the animation frames. So in the above example, if you wanted to go from sad to happy, you could just jump from frame 2 and skip the normal frame. This also is useful if you have something that displays a state in the same area, like a word of the object you have touched. Instead of adding all the images and making a complex show-hide behaviors to put all the words as frames in an animation object and just jump to the frame. It's faster to build, easier to maintain, and uses a lot less RAM. And so that's the animation object top to bottom.